saw I got a Quang Tri and Phu Bai the entire time we were active in South Vietnam. We flew at Hamburger Hill. We were there at the assaults on Bastogne, Fable, Airborne, Eagle's Nest, O'Reilly, Ripcord, Quezon, Rock Pipe, and hundreds of unknown and opposed sorties throughout northern I-Corps. The Lancers flew all through Lam Son 719, where the Army Aviation underwent its harshest test. When Lam Son 719 was ended, the Lancers had 8 aircraft remaining, and none of them were flyable. The Lancers were active in South Vietnam for 2.5 years. During that time, the Lancers flew 65 aircraft for 320% replacement rate. Only one of the original Hueys made it all the way through the 2.5 years. One only made it 1 day. We fired approximately 4 million rounds through our M60 machine guns, made untold numbers of emergency medevacs and recoveries. During the 2.5 years the battalion was operational in South Vietnam, the battalion flew 105,338 combat hours. Bravo Company flew 51,833 hours. So we flew some 49% of the total battalion hours during the 2.5 years. That was strictly the fault of our maintenance department. They could scrounge, steal, rob, replace just about anything you ever thought of, and get us back in the air. We were flying engines that belonged to the first cav. So it was, you got to give all the credit to them. We didn't do it, they did. During the 2.5 years the 158th was operational in South Vietnam, the 158th was awarded 3 Presidential Unit citations, Valorous Unit Award, 42 Silver Stars, 423 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 12 Soldiers Medals, 1,815 Bronze Stars, 2,023 Army Commendation Medals, 6,271 Air Medals, 150 Purple Hearts, the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm, and the Vietnamese Civic Action Honor Medal First Class. B Company by itself got a Presidential Unit citation for Dong Ao Ba Mountain or Hamburger Hill, a Presidential Unit citation for working with the Studies and Observation Group known as SOG and MACV, Presidential Unit citation for Laos and Lam Son 719, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Valorous Unit Award for Fire Base Ripcord, the Republic of Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Palm in 1969, the Republic of Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Palm in 1970, the Republic of Vietnam Civic Action Honor Medal First Class in 1970. After we returned to Fort Campbell, the company took part in several covert operations in South America and Central Africa. In 1989, the company was moved into the top secret Task Force 158 for the second planned Iran hostage attempt. After the hostage was released in 82, the Army kept Task Force 158 intact as a Special Operations Aviation Unit, and it became Task Force 160. And eventually that became the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. During their time at Fort Campbell, the Lancers were the first Army unit to be equipped with new Black Hawks, the first unit to use night vision goggles in helicopter combat operations. It pioneered many of the techniques used in night flying to date. The 158th was the Army test bed for special aviation operations, and the Lancers led the way. B Company was detached from the 101st in 1986, and so were their awards and their official military lineage, while the personnel of B Company were mostly absorbed by the newly formed 160th. The 158th was later redesignated as the 5th Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment on 16 September 1987. The remaining personnel of 158th were transferred to 160th SOAR. Later, the awards of B-158 were assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 158th Aviation Regiment. Much of the history of the 158th Assault Helicopter Battalion, including the Lancers, has been lost as part of the efforts to hide the developing 160th SOAR from the public eye. We were a victim of 21. A large group of us spent time with the Lancers at Hangar 12. And one of our own, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Jacoby, retired, discovered the missing link. Today's Lancers and the original Lancers from 1968 have the same unit identification code, WFJ4BO. Since DODAD, or the Department of Defense agency that assigns numbers and records, never makes a mistake, and since they haven't made a mistake since George Washington started the Army, we are one and the same. We're brother Lancers. Whether anybody wants to believe it or not, they don't retire a number and they don't reuse a number. If you got it, you are them. I'm going to give an introduction now to Lieutenant Colonel Mike Jacoby, who retired some years ago from the Army. But Mike joined the Army as an enlisted paratrooper. He was later accepted to flight school, became a warrant officer, and flew combat missions in Vietnam for 2.5 years. Mike flew in some of the most intense battles of the war, including the 1968 Tet Offensive in Hue City. He received a direct commission as a first lieutenant in Vietnam. Lancer 26 often flew missions for the top-secret MACV SOG in Laos and North Vietnam. In March of 71, Mike flew in Lamson 719, and Lancer 26 retired as a lieutenant colonel with the Presidential Unit Citation, the Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, and 39 air medals. And ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Mike Jacoby.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, Lieutenant Colonel Jacoby and Mr. Neesmith will be presenting a plaque to the commander of Bravo Company 5101, Captain John Waite, to commemorate their brotherhood as Lancers.
Joshua, the Lieutenant of the Department of Health. He's not here. I have one more task. Can somebody give me an 8-minute warning? This phone is ticking down and it ain't doing 8 minutes, and I got 8 minutes. Somebody give me 8 minutes. Somebody go like that. Bruce, I got that microphone. He may be the only crew chief you've ever known to get a distinguished flying cross. He took out a 51 caliber hit. An aircraft got shot down on the DMZ. Rescue aircraft got shot down. Found up 22 men down on the ground. The last aircraft in had Bruce aboard. Bruce got to DFC for being a really, really good shot. I'm supposed to talk about Lamson 719. In order to put that into perspective, you have to understand that the Lancers were there in 1969, 70, and 71. And there's nothing that happened in Lamson 719 that all these people didn't see. It's just that Lamson 719 was condensed, but there was 700 aircraft. In order to understand how it's even humanly possible For an aircraft so fragile and vulnerable, hovering and flying at low air speeds and LZs, you have to understand the Cobras. The only way that's humanly possible. It felt like when you were going into an LZ, the Cobras were orbiting beside you. It felt like you were flying through a funnel of steel. It was incredible. When you got in there, you either landed or you threw them ropes or a ladder and you came back out. Peter Lane, wherever you're at, depicted on this monument those extractions with a ladder and a rope. And Peter, that sketch you made will be on that monument for thousands of years. Thank you. We prepared for Lamson for about a week. And first we had to take Quezon. Quezon had been abandoned. That was probably the most masterful planned operation I've ever seen or participated in. We had all these aircraft lined up in an extremely long formation, and everybody had a separate LZ, maybe 4 or 5 aircraft here, 4 or 5 aircraft there. We had to take all the key terrain around Lamson simultaneously to put in all those aircraft with all those troops on the ground in Lamson. So that's how we went in there. At the same time, simultaneously, there's a highway called 9 that came from the coast all the way up through Vietnam, all the way up through Laos. That had to be reopened. They had bulldozers being brought in and placed on Highway 9. They had these humongous bridges being brought in by cranes and set over rivers that had been bombed out. By the time we came back again, we saw convoys rushing down that highway. 101st Airborne had an AO on the extreme north of Vietnam, bordered by North Vietnam and bordered by Laos. That's where all the supplies and personnel came through. So they came through across the DMZ, or they hooked into Laos and they came across into our AO. That's why 54% of all fatalities in Vietnam happened in our AO, in I Corps. There was 2 formations of 120 ships. Trail formation, 120 ships, 30-second separations. That's a 100-mile-long formation. When we retook Quezon, they spent almost a week, I think it was 6 days, preparing to invade Laos. They brought in soldiers by the thousands upon thousands, all South Vietnamese. There was no American allowed to cross the border by federal law, the Church Amendment, except with the exception of air crews. So we have this massive buildup. There's a photo I'm looking at, and it's aircraft as far as you can see lined up on a runway, and a bunch of us Lancers. And I looked at it, and way back over there in the hills, I could see Laos. And it just struck you. They knew we were coming. To be polite, they said there was a leak in Saigon. And so they've prepared, as hard as they could, our arrival. They prepared 1,000 anti-aircraft emplacements. They had hundreds of anti-aircraft weapons. They would rotate through those 1,000 sites. We lined up with this humongous formation. We crossed the border. And the first thing I remember is Paul Stewart up ahead said, "I'm hit," pulled out to the left, crashed and burned. His tail rotor wasn't turning. LZ Lolo was the worst day in our Army aviation history. There was 11 aircraft shot down. The Scambetti family is here. They lost Paul. The Anderson family, Lieutenant Anderson, they're watching right now. I know for a fact. I had my right seat was, he took a round through the boot, like making a new eyelet for your boot. And when I went back, I dropped him off with the medics. I hovered over to the maintenance area, and they said, "What do you need?" I said, "A co-pilot." They gave me some kid that looked like he was about 15 years old. He was from a different unit. I didn't know who he was, and he didn't know who I was. He jumped into like a little leaguer beaver, and we went higher and back over the Lancers. We picked up another load, and we went right back to Lolo. When we lost Paul and Charles here on the monument, it was Manuel Cazzuela was flying, and Paul was hit, no exit wound. He looked normal. And Chuck was hit when the aircraft, but Cat got it on the ground, troops got off, he let the rotor. And there was a soldier whose combative family got to meet, who took care of Paul that afternoon. He was still alive. If he moaned a little bit, he'd put water on his lips. They eventually got him out, and he died in the hospital. Charles was evacuated back to the surgical hospital at Quezon, and the medic worked with him a little bit. The pilot sitting there. The medic worked with him a little bit, took a few steps back, and did the most patriotic gesture you could ever see. Saluted the dead officer. When we talk about SOG, to put it in perspective, I'll have to read a little short thing here. But CNN thought that they were on the verge of this huge discovery of these assassins or something. In 1998, they ran a story on it. That resulted in a huge Pentagon investigation of who SOG was. They named them Studies and Isolation Group, the Studies Group. That was just to disguise them. And the Fayetteville newspaper ran this little clip. And the newspaper said, in 1968, SOG had more people killed and injured than it had positions. They were the most heroic, top secret group of men who may have ever existed, who were totally unknown, sworn to secrecy until a serendipitously discovered in 1998 by CNN News, leading to a major Pentagon investigation, where it was discovered that SOG actually were extremely top secret, small units operating deep behind enemy lines in countries in and around surrounding Vietnam, and who received 10 Medal of Honors, 23 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2,000 other awards of valor. And that's more than twice the entirety of the 82nd Airborne in its entire history. And this is a Fayette Newsville, North Carolina newspaper, which is the home of the 82nd Airborne. Am I 8 minutes up? Tony, where were you? He extracted one of those Medal of Honor winners, along with bigger deer that. Tony extracted the lieutenant, I can't think of his name. He was RT, Kansas. The idea was that outside of Quezon was to do an insertion and then do a phony withdrawal and then leave them there. They had 2,000 people, enemy, surrounded this hilltop, and they were about to be annihilated. And I've got an audio of the whole conversation of all the aircraft. You can hear Tony's aircraft when he's coming out of the LZ saying, "I've got massive wounded on board and the 1-0 is dead." That's the lieutenant that got the Medal of Honor. Barry Beard was talked to. Barry Beard comes out and Covey is wanting to know, what's your status? He says, you got a clean LZ. You got a clean LZ. That means there's no living soul down there. I'm out of time. I had a whole lot.
Today we are here to honor these 22 Lancer warriors who have made the ultimate sacrifice to give one's life for their country. Duty is its own reward. Airborne, air mobile, air assault. The reading of the names. Specialist 5, Arthur Smith. Staff Sergeant James Dorsey, Jr. CW2, Ben Sutton. Warrant Officer Carl Hughes. Sergeant Michael Cox. Specialist 4th Class Marvin Sheen. Captain James Lyon. Warrant Officer James Burton, Jr. CW2 Richard Worthington, Jr. Warrant Officer Robert Kirk. Sergeant Frank Hernandez. Specialist 4th Class William Weiss, Jr. Captain Eugene Miller. Warrant Officer George Berry, Jr. Sergeant William Vaught, III. Specialist 4th Class Stephen Perkins. Specialist 4th Class Alvin Ivanhoff. PFC Walter Taylor, Jr. Lieutenant Charles Anderson. Specialist 4th Class Paul Scambetti. Specialist 4th Class Charles Kalani. Lieutenant James Williamson. Those are the 22 Lancers from Bravo Company, Vietnam. Thank you.
Staff Sergeant Bush, Chaplain West, and the Gold Star family will now place a wreath at the base of the Lancer Vietnam Memorial to memorialize all our fallen comrades. Please be seated.